The bush is dense and unforgiving, and the boys are on a quest for vengeance. I'm the Nightingale, Matisse Van Rossum.
I'm Ben Sheets, and did you know that toilets flush in the opposite direction in Australia?
Oh shit, I did know that.
Oh, wow. Hi, I'm Cleveland Mosier, and I made a mistake, guys. I threw the baby out with the bathwater.
Oh shit. Welcome to the pod, people. And today we're going to be talking about a different kind of horror. A more unconventional kind of horror. Usually, when we're talking about horror, we're talking about the intangible. The spooky ghost. The scary skeleton. The Swedish hippie. But this time, we're going to be talking about the horror of something much, much greater. We're talking about the horror of Western colonialism.
Horrific it was. Oh, boy.
We're going to be talking today about The Nightingale, a film released internationally in 2018, but it didn't get its U.S. release until this year, 2019. It is written and directed by Jennifer Kent of The Babadook, and it stars, I'm probably going to butcher these names, I apologize in advance, Aisling Franciosi, Sam Claflin, Bekali Ganambar, and Damon Harriman. It is set in 1825 as Claire, a young Irish convict woman, chases a British officer through the rugged Tasmanian wilderness, bent on revenge for a terrible act of violence he committed against her family. On the way, she enlists the services of an Aboriginal tracker named Billy, who is also marked by trauma from his own violence-filled past.
Rose-colored glasses this film does not have. I tell you what, these are not the good old days. I'm gonna start broad strokes. If you can't tell by the shakiness in my voice, I just watched this movie. All three of us just did. The credits just rolled,
Hot and
we're
fresh.
recording. I'm harrowed. There is little question in my mind whether this is technically a horror film or not. This is definitely a horror movie. I don't tend to watch too many, like, rape revenge films. I think there was a time before on the podcast where I actually kind of had the wrong idea and saw the genre as, like, somewhat sexist. Because I was relatively misinformed. I'll be very open and honest about that. Ben, I think you corrected me, saying, like, actually a good number of rape revenge films have been directed by, like, female, like, feminist directors, and they make very poignant statements, and they're not exploitative. You want to talk about a primo example of that. I mean, this film is that. For anyone who requires it, like, big old trigger warning on this film.
Yeah.
Big
safe.
old trigger warning.
Well, it's funny.
little doubt there.
It's funny you mention that because on both IMDb and Letterboxd, this movie technically isn't labeled as a horror movie. But in a lot of ways, it does follow that rape revenge genre without feeling particularly exploitative.
The key is realism, if you were to ask me. This film saves itself from that, and even though, like, the core plot line is she is raped, she seeks revenge, beyond that, it holds so few of those hallmarks.
It doesn't follow very much the typical form of a rape revenge film. It has some of the same themes. I knew very little about this film going in, except the basic IMDb premise, which I just read a couple of minutes ago, and I was expecting a much different film. I was expecting more of a standard kind of rape revenge, where, you know, she is wronged and she becomes then a total rage-fueled badass and, like, hunts down the people who wronged her and wreaks terrible vengeance. And that's not really what happens.
Yeah,
in this
there's
movie
no,
at
like,
all.
traps that are set in this movie, you know, like...
And realistically, she remains emotionally quite vulnerable throughout the whole thing. She has conviction and she's driven by the desire for revenge, but she is extremely out of her element.
I saw a lot of more influences from Westerns and
Yes.
even arguably, I would say, in some ways, buddy cop movies, especially stuff
Sure.
like In the Heat of the Night, where it's very race relations heavy. And it's, you know, two people who are at odds with each other kind of coming together by the end. I think what makes that work is just kind of the seriousness of the film. It is very intense and doesn't pull punches by any means.
Like you mentioned, it's not really a quote unquote like classic horror film. Like you said, IMDb and Letterboxd don't even qualify it as such, but Jennifer Kent is a horror film director. You know, her last film was The Babadook, unquestionably a horror film. And though this film isn't what you would expect from a horror film, I was horrified for a lot of it, and probably more emotionally shaken by scenes in this film than some of the other just straight up horror films that we've watched this year.
Yeah.
So I think that it is deserving of the horror descriptor at the very least.
Quite.
Even if it doesn't fit the typical conventions of the genre.
Another point, moving into how this film addresses race, we live, in a time right now where like race-related commentary is very poignant in cinema. We see a lot of examples of like that commentary done well, and we see a lot of examples of this commentary done poorly. This is so, in my camp, for done extremely well. Considering, too, that, like, they're at odds with each other. Like, they have to, like, find common ground through their hardship and all that. Like, a lot of those, the beats of this film would have set me up to believe, had I heard them in advance, that it wouldn't have been handled all that well. But I always felt like there was characterized like justification in any sequence, and that they were driven to those directions by legitimate means in the film. I found the movie to be extremely believable, even during some of the more like extreme moments.
I think you're right that it is believable, and that the racial divide themes are handled pretty well. That being said, I did find a lot of it quite predictable.
Sure.
At least in the sense that, Claire hires Billy to, be her guide through the Tasmanian wilderness to track, the officer who has so horribly wronged her. And at the beginning, as they're setting out, she doesn't trust him. She's keeping a gun at his back. Most of the film, she's calling him boy.
Yeah.
And it's like, as soon as I saw that, you mentioned it's like, oh, good, she's not a Mary Sue, and she's not the only she's not the only non-racist character in the movie.
Because by the time that she shows herself to be a racist, by that point in the film, we can only see her as this figure who's been savaged, by these officers. Mm-hmm. To then show that she's flawed, sure. that she is like outwardly racist, towards this guy. I was like, oh, thank God. Yeah. Like you were saying, like,
right.
I was glad that she wasn't just like a purely likable person, and that she wasn't going to be like on a pedestal for the rest of the film.
Sure. And
it gave her an arc, even though we knew where the arc was going.
That's exactly.
I fully agree. Like, the story beats are pretty laid out, and they're things that we've seen before.
From the beginning with her calling him boy and stuff like that, it's like, by the end, they're going to be the best of friends.
Yep.
Sure.
They're gonna realize that they have more in common than they thought, and they're going to come together, and they're going to succeed together, which is exactly what happens.
Certainly.
That being said, even though it was predictable, I thought the execution was great.
Right.
Even though I kind of knew where it was going a lot of the time, I felt good about it.
One thing I want to say before getting too far into this is I want to tread a little lightly with the racism stuff, just because
Sure.
we're coming from the lens of white Americans, and this is a movie in Australia about Aborigine people, and our lens is from a race relation standpoint of the U.S. And I feel like while it's handled pretty well in this film, we don't necessarily have the clearest picture of the history of what's going down in this film. I almost feel like at times it feels like a simplified version of race relations in terms of, we don't really see too much of Billy's history. We see him do some rituals and some tradition, but most of the film is from Claire's perspective.
Sure.
Certainly. That's a good point to bring up, for sure. I grew up, watching like a lot of historical stuff. My dad is a historian, and I love media that is set in this era, but not in this location. Or I haven't seen that much that's in this location. I certainly do enjoy it. I love historical works, but my knowledge of Australia and Tasmania and the events surrounding like the colonization are extremely limited. So from all of us, like we are putting that out there, that our expectations are limited. And
part of that reason I bring that up is I had pretty limited knowledge of this movie going in. I did know one thing though, is that it was pretty controversial when it was first shown at Cannes. A lot of people saw it as conflating feminism with colonialism. I don't know if I necessarily agree,
do not see that.
But I would like to discuss that a little bit because it is through the lens of rape revenge. It does have kind of a very feminist viewpoint, but I don't think it necessarily conflates those.
I think it's pretty clear that the position of this film is that colonialism bad.
For literally everyone.
For everybody.
All parties. It's not good.
Yeah, because I mean, Claire is a Irish convict.
Right.
You know, and
she's suffering at the hands of colonialism.
Right. You know, the Irish have been suffering at the hands of the British for hundreds of years. And in that sense, it's more of an issue of class rather than race. But in the case of, you know, this film in Australia, or more specifically Tasmania, where this film is set, is, you know, seen very heavily through the lens of race, because we see how abysmally the soldiers, and hell, just like even the colonialists, you know, the people in the villages treat the Aboriginal people. That is what ends up bonding Billy and Claire ultimately, is that the British are bad to both of us, so we have more in common than we thought. White men have taken from both of us.
Yeah. The director is, as far as I understand, like a white woman.
Yes.
Like she's writing like
Jennifer
Jennifer
Kent is not Aboriginal.
Yeah, she's writing like a perspective that is viable. I think.
Well, yeah, she's writing it from the lens of a white woman, and of, you know, that is what she is. Mm-hmm. So I think from that perspective, it makes sense. I did not conflate the feminist views of this film with colonialism at all.
No.
I didn't.
And to be clear too, like you see like a good number of like kind colonialists in this movie too. And fewer than the bad ones. Well,
but
because the villain takes up the majority of the screen time, because that's our story is very singular here. We're just seeing those glimpses of it.
Sure, but
like, it's because it's so inherent in the culture of that time.
Right, but the thing is like they come across brutality everywhere. Like, yeah, we're seeing most of it from our very singular villain, but when they're traveling, those bandits come upon them in the night and try to rape Claire, and then Billy saves her. We see the slavers multiple times who are following them, who once again try to rape Claire, and she gets away from them. And then when we see new slavers again at the end, you know, they just murder in cold blood their Aboriginal prisoners because they try to stand up for themselves. So I don't think that...
Well, but like, those are all the bad ones, but there are good people in the film as well, like, that help her out along the way.
My point is that there's fewer, though, Cleveland.
Well, of course, it's a dark horror film.
That's all I'm saying.
The thing is, they help her. They don't really help him outside of the elderly couple near the very end.
And the Irish couple at the beginning as well.
They have nothing to do with Billy.
Yeah.
They try to stop her from going after the officer. They're kind to her, but they're not particularly kind to Billy or anything. There are people who help, but that even so, Billy is still the outcast. People are willing to help Claire because she's a white woman.
Correct.
But they're still not willing to give the same courtesy to Billy until the elderly couple towards the very end, after they've seen so much horror. And that's what makes that couple such a breath of fresh air. When they even come up on her, first thing Claire does is pull up her gun and say, don't you touch the black, you know? And he's like, I'm not gonna. Get on the cart, and like, you look hungry. And it's like, whoa, shit. Wow, this is not what any of us have been expecting at this point. Yeah. You know, they've met pretty much only cruelty up until that point.
Yeah, and I think that makes it such a poignant, and that's why it's such an effectively poignant statement, right? That those people were there.
Exactly.
You know.
Well, even then, you know, the wife wasn't that into it either.
Yeah, I thought that was great.
It was literally just the husband that was the only
redeemable
redeemable colonialist in that respect.
Which is like a really fascinating dynamic too, and you don't see that very often. Like usually it's just like the kind couple, but like saying like the one like the wife was still like very outwardly racist was interesting.
Again, I want to tread on very lightly with the stuff, like saying there were good colonialists in the
Colonialism
film
was
is
evil
like
and horrible.
saying there were good slave owners. It's not a good look.
No.
I agree with you, but that there are a handful of kind people in the film spread out amongst the just endless.
I think the better way to put it is the film does a good job of creating human characters. They don't feel like caricatures.
Sure,
Quite.
You know, the slight exception to that is the group of villains.
Is the lieutenant especially? Yeah. He is
an outright sociopath.
Yeah, he is just insanely evil.
Yeah, I first off fully agree that the things that he does in that film are Snidely Whiplash level of evil. I would also reckon personally that sort of person absolutely exists. Like,
sure.
It also, down to his station, it is believable. He's an officer, which is very specifically like in colonialist, like military systems, like there's sort of the bridging of the gap class-wise. And so you often see like these officer characters that like sort of see themselves as above the rest, but they're really not, you know, like everyone's at the same level, like at that point. And it's where you kind of breach into like a different class system. Sociopaths tend to ascend social ladders in that respect. So him fitting that station made a great deal of sense. I thought that was fucking fascinating, frankly, like how well he fit into that society as like a textbook sociopath.
Yeah, I think that you could say that his acts of evil are maybe a bit over-exaggerated, but I don't think that the way he behaves is necessarily cartoonish, like a Snidely Whiplash kind of thing, because he's not like a villain to the extent that he's like monologuing and like twirling his mustache, you know, even when he shoots the kid at the end, you know, he's just like, I just can't stand the noise of it all, you know, like he's just, he himself is so overwhelmed that he's really just letting his baser self take over.
The way I interpreted that is he doesn't even consider the kid a human. It's
right,
an it,
exactly.
You know, and he does this multiple times in the movie. He does this during the scene with the baby, for example. He calls the baby an it as well.
And it's crying is what is constantly infuriating him. It is literally the noise that just drives him to a breaking point.
I saw that as more of an evil because he's so dehumanizing.
Well, yeah, no, he's extremely, like Cleveland said, he's a textbook sociopath, but in a way that I believe that people exist.
Oh, yes,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
He's not a cartoon character.
This character doesn't feel like, he's a villain for the sake of the film needing to have one. He feels very set in his environment. He feels more like a study of sociopathy than he does just a fulcrum.
Yeah.
I appreciated that from a writing perspective. Like all of the events that occur had a solid degree of thought and justification put into them.
Yeah.
Every event. I'd be curious to see if y'all felt the same. Everything I saw happen, like it felt like an extreme and it felt very justified. And
yeah, well,
that
I mean,
keeps you hooked.
I think it's meant to like really try to fucking drive you down. You use the word harrowing. It's an extremely harrowing experience. There's just one constant cruelty after another. The movie's 2 hours 15 minutes. It's a draining experience, and those little moments of genuine kindness are very refreshing in a good way. I feel like it's intentionally, holding you underwater and letting you come up every now and then for a breath of fresh air before shoving your head back down.
Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing is to put a capstone on the villain. He's a sociopath in our perspective because he's so cruel to the white people of this movie. But when you think about it, the cruelty of a lot of these characters towards the Aborigine people make them equally sociopaths.
Yeah, no, totally. I agree. You're absolutely right. He's the main villain. He is the symbol of colonialism. The idea of dehumanizing everyone around him. Mm-hmm. Even at the beginning, he says about Claire, like when her husband comes in, he's like, she's my wife. She's paid her due. And he's like, no, she's my property. and I can do whatever I want. He is that overarching representation of the dehumanization that colonialism brings. And we're just seeing in the film that it affects everybody. It can be directed at everyone. And I think in that sense, like I said before, it's a class thing, with a race thing wrapped up in it. And we even see how he treats the sergeant, who is also a despicable human character. He's more savage and stupid and bestial than the lieutenant is, but the lieutenant even treats him like dog shit too, When he almost shoots him and the boy says no, he's like, you owe your life to a child. Never forget that.
It's crazy how just well thought out, like, so much of the period related things seems to be in this movie. And while, like, I don't have much knowledge of that location in time, I do recognize, like, the societal, like, trends and some of the stereotypes in films that are often portrayed out in period films. And one of the biggest ones is hygiene. And this movie gets hygiene very right. Like, that sounds like a really small, silly thing, but, like, so often you get, like, the peasants that are, like, literally wallowing in mud. When we see that in the film, it's towards the climax, like when she's just, like, covered in filth, like, in the woods.
Yeah, because she's been trekking
for days.
Through the bush for
and
days.
You see how, like, regular passersby see her. And it's I thought that was, like, really poignant, because at the beginning, even then, she's essentially like a convict slave, and she's still very pristine, very clean. And her husband, is like, has good hygiene as well. All of the people who are, like, at convict status are all, like, wearing clean clothes and practicing good hygiene. And you see the same too with, like, the Aboriginals as well. Like, they all feel like, from what I understand, like tribal societies, which are very hygiene oriented. I thought that was fucking rad. You usually see, like, all the peasants covered in filth in those sorts of pieces, and it was nice to see that.
In a lot of ways, the period element of this film reminded me a lot of The Revenant.
Yeah.
In terms of the, focus on accuracy. And like you said, hygiene is a big part of it as well. And obviously, the trekking through the wilderness leads to very similar aesthetics.
It's an epic journey through the wilderness.
But I think it's done excellent in this. I think
it's less of a spectacle in
it
this.
feels very immersive because it feels very period accurate. One thing I noticed that I wanted to get your guys' opinion on is, much like The Lighthouse, this film was also in 4:3.
Was it 4:3?
It was 4:3.
It was definitely a different aspect ratio, but it seemed like it had less space on the side, or less space on the sides than The Lighthouse
I think
did.
what it is
square.
there were so many wide shots that it felt less claustrophobic.
That is true. The Lighthouse was very good at that.
I noticed immediately that it was in a different aspect ratio.
Just a larger one is what you thought.
Yeah, I thought I didn't think it was as small, but I mean, the only times I've seen The Lighthouse so far is in theaters, and we watched this on a considerably smaller screen, so it probably threw off my perspective a little bit. I was bothered by it at first, and then I got so wrapped up in the movie that I no longer noticed.
I've been watching Star Trek a lot. Like, I'm used to watching shows in that format.
I think it's a fine aspect ratio. It draws attention to itself. It draws attention to itself on our modern screens because they're so wide. But for fucking ever, that was the common framing for everything. So
what do you guys think the intent behind that was? I think maybe it was just to immerse people in the period a little bit more. That sounds kind of weird, but like you said, it's a bit of a dated medium, so it automatically evokes an older time.
Sure.
That's how I view it. And,
I'm inclined to agree with that.
It does in some ways emphasize the starkness of the wilderness just because you're so tight into it. You don't have these wide shots, but at the same time, it's not necessarily as claustrophobic.
I think it's less effective than in The Lighthouse. Like you said on our episode about The Lighthouse, Cleve, you didn't think it would work if it was in black and white and widescreen, or if it was in 4:3 and color.
That is true.
And this is in 4:3 and color. And I agree with you, Ben, in that it evokes a sort of older aesthetic. It takes you, and puts you back in the past to an extent, but with something like The Lighthouse, which is in black and white, you know, it's in the 1890s. It's like Thomas Edison is, you know, starting to experiment with film and stuff. Like it feels more of the time.
I feel like the intent was more there in The Lighthouse.
Yeah,
this
is in 1825 in the Tasmanian wilderness. Like the idea of film as a medium is like so far removed from this setting that like to do something to like so readily draw attention to that. I don't know what the intent was behind it, and I don't know if it worked. I think that the film works very well in spite of it, though, because
Yes.
I like I said, I stopped noticing because I was too engrossed in what was happening. The acting is so good and the characters are so good that like I stopped giving a shit. But like for the first 10 minutes, I'm like, what is with this aspect ratio?
I still want to say that I feel that way about The Lighthouse, even after watching this film. I don't think that the Lighthouse would have necessarily worked as well if it was in a wider format in black and white, or if it was in color in that format. I think that stylistically it works very well for the bleakness and coldness of that film, and the singularity of the use of light for the lighthouse.
Sure.
Works
Yeah.
for that film.
I've
for
definitely
this film,
come
I thought
around
worked
on
fine.
it more for The Lighthouse, but
Well,
this
that's the
is-
thing. Like we mentioned, you know, it feels like the intent is much more there in The Lighthouse. You know, it's very clear why it was shot like
Right.
that.
Also, The Lighthouse is a much more stylized film. The framing is much more poignant. Like it's an ornamented movie. There's all the crazy fish stuff and, you know, the playing with time. It's a much, I don't like to use the word wacky, but it does play at a lot more like fantasy sort of related things, whereas this film is trying very hard to just be set in realism.
This is the kind of film where the intent of the form is to make you forget about the form.
Yes.
Like you said, to be immersed in it, which I think it does a great job of. Something like The Lighthouse that is more stylized, you're meant to be struck by the imagery. You're supposed to take notice of how beautifully and strangely shot it is. This is a left turn for Jennifer Kent for only her second film. Year of the sophomore bump continues, boys.
Yeah, wow, 2019.
Yeah, this is
Wow.
very, very different from the Babadook. I don't know if I would have recognized that they were made by the same director, except for a couple of very particular sequences, specifically Claire's dream sequence.
I was about to say,
Nightmare
yes.
at the end, very reminiscent of the Babadook in not only the way it's shot, but also the way it's presented, to have that sort of ghostly figure of comfort come to her and then become monstrous as it repeats a phrase straight out of the Babadook. I thought it was great, though. I thought it was a nice little creative flourish. It's like, okay, yes, here is what I recognize of Jennifer Kent. That being said, I'm not upset that this film is very different from the Babadook. I think it goes to show that as an artist, Jennifer Kent has some fucking range in what she does. To go from something like the Babadook, which was, you know, very small and self-contained, largely single location, to go to a period piece that is so kind of epic and sprawling, and to pull it off so well.
I agree wholeheartedly. The nightmare sequence of like seeing our protagonist being haunted by the events that have occurred to them is like, it's a scene as old as time.
Yeah.
But once again, it felt so justified. She has been through that horrific event, and you know, like it's a byproduct of your PTSD to have those sorts of night terrors. Very believable. And it just, once again, puts you into her shoes, you know, as you suffer with her in this film. I found all of them to be effective.
Well, it's funny you mentioned PTSD because I feel like that, as well as trauma, are the big things that tie these two films together, the Babadook and the Nightingale. Oh, yeah. Because both main characters go through very traumatic experiences.
They essentially but each of them start their journey traumatized.
Yeah, and we see the journey of them coming to terms with that and trying to find closure with that. And
Absolutely.
In that respect, I definitely see the progression from one to the other. While they're, you know, stylistically very different, like thematically in some respects, they're somewhat similar.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the Babadook ends not with the destruction or the banishment of the beast, but learning to control with it and cope with it.
They both end with a sort of closure.
Yeah,
to that,
exactly.
To that trauma.
In the Nightingale, you know, they end up getting their revenge, but it's not like they've defeated colonialism.
No,
it's not like they haven't defeated the.
We know how that story ends.
We do.
It's still quite rough. Like, and so to get like any respite,
right?
You know, like played to a sense of realism is very gratifying.
Right. Well, I like too that Claire seems to find her peace more through realizing that she's not alone and that she has things in common with Billy, and that sort of solidarity she shares with him. You know, she has that scene where she confronts the lieutenant in town after, you know, he's essentially gotten away with it. She no longer feels the need, you know, for bloody violence. She's had her taste of that with Hugo Weaving's son.
Oh, yeah.
We'll get back to that. But, you know, she just wants to go and tell him to his face, like, even despite all of this, I own myself, you don't own me, you know, I don't need revenge. And then Billy takes it for her anyway.
Yes.
Because they sort of flip-flop, you know, because his uncle, or his adoptive uncle, is murdered cold-heartedly by the lieutenant. Like, he murders just about everybody he comes across. So Billy takes his vengeance, but he dies for it. Or we assume he will die.
Well, the film ends very ambiguously in that respect. It's most likely, you know...
Highly likely.
He got shot, so... He most likely...
With a lead ball.
But, you know, it ends on the beach with the two of them, and it's very bittersweet in its ending because, you know, while it has kind of a nice closure to it, you know, the sun rises at the very end, she is left alone. But she has that peace of mind of the closure of the situation, even though, honestly, it's still a hopeless situation for her.
Right.
And, you know, in a similar way, while colonialism wasn't defeated, I suppose you could argue that there's that bit of closure of understanding, at least in Claire. You know?
Mm-hmm. Sure, of choosing to go on in spite of everything else. You know, like you said, it's very bittersweet. It's a beautiful scene at the end, but the implications that it leaves are still quite bleak.
Well, she even says herself that she's already died. Her soul has died.
Sure, metaphorically,
essentially,
yeah.
Like she has so little to go on with, and that's why it's so fitting that she ends with a rising sun. I mean, I was choking up over the credits, guys. Like, yeah, I was very personally moved by that.
It's a quite moving ending.
Yeah, it's powerful.
I agree.
I had a footnote. There's actually another historical point that I actually can bring up with some degree of utility, and that is how people treat muskets across the board, and very specifically, not just like
this is
like this
such
film,
a you thing. I'm gonna let you go, but this is such a you thing.
I'll make it brief. I promise.
By all means, have fun.
Essentially, I mean a couple of things by that. There's a great deal of awareness written in around how the muskets operate in this film, and I don't mean just like, oh, credit, they don't fire multiple times, good job. The film goes far above that. First off, there's a sequence where her rifle gets backwatered. Okay, that's good. Good marks on that. That's a good start. You know, because we see her go through a river, and then later on she tries to shoot someone, the rifle doesn't work. But then we see multiple characters in this movie aim high, or low. In her circumstance with the first soldier she comes across. She goes to shoot, and she automatically like pulls her rifle down to the ground, and you get a definite sense that it's not because of like the weight of it, because you see her like carrying it several other times. It's a natural reflex. There are accounts of rifle accuracy during that time period and rifleman studies, and there was a big reason why, like during certain colonial wars, the Civil War, the Napoleonic Wars, you have a number of skirmishes that lasted hours of soldiers just on a field shooting at each other because no one was trying to hit each other. Modern warfare is very different in like when it comes
Call
to
of Duty, Modern Warfare.
I mean, yes, though, like close quarter
Sorry.
combat. No, it's funny. Like close quarter style combat is about reflex training, and we've changed the way that we train our soldiers so that they can kill more easily with that sense. But when it came to like traditional militaries of that time, whether you were trained or not, most folks aimed high or low. It was extremely difficult to kill someone. And you see the boy, you see her, I think you see someone else at some point aim high or low. It was very gratifying because you usually don't see that. Oh, when they're running away from the farm, a farmer shoots at them.
Oh, yeah.
Now, again, these are also non-bored barrels, so like also accurate to just try and shoot at someone from 30 feet away and miss. That was definitely a thing as well.
Well, she didn't miss. She didn't miss when she shot Hugo Weaving's son. She didn't.
She
hit what
did
was,
not.
She didn't hit what she was aiming for. Yeah.
And I also loved that because like the guy had already been hitting the other leg as well. But again,
Yeah.
it felt believable because she's aiming low. She couldn't, like necessarily just like hit Mark, and so instead he gets popped in the leg. And that's the second time she tries to shoot at him as well. And that guy gets shot in both legs. Like,
and she stabs him a bunch and then bashes his skull in with the butt of the musket. He gets probably one of the worst deaths in the film, and there's something that feels even like more impactful about it because like there's no doubt that he took part in the atrocities that were done to her, but he's the only one who has a conscience about it. We see like he's the young ensign, he feels bad about it, but the lieutenant just keeps berating him until he shuts up. So like not to say that he is innocent, but the one that she like really brutalizes.
Well, he's the one that killed her baby.
Yes, he is the and he says that it was an accident, and I believe him, but it doesn't change the horror of the situation. That's just
He accidentally threw the baby against a wall.
Against a wall.
Spoiler alert, this film features a very graphic infanticide sequence. I mean, we're well past spoilers, but
and
this one just sort of starts.
And a grand total of 3 rape scenes? 5 rape scenes?
Well, okay, one of them has 2 rapes.
Okay,
Once,
yeah.
but-
No, we see Claire raped twice within the first 20-30 minutes of the movie, and then the Aboriginal woman who they capture along the way gets raped by the sergeant and the lieutenant.
There's also a number of attempted rape sequences.
Yes. Attempted.
More rapes than an HBO show.
Yeah, right.
That being said, they're absolutely brutal and
drawn out too. Like
drawn out, yeah.
We're not talking irreversible drawn out, but it makes you sit in it.
they're less clinical than irreversible, which arguably makes them harder to sit through because you are with Claire while she's being raped.
Yeah.
It's close on her face.
I started out this film pretty hungry, and by the opening title card, I was not hungry, like from during the film at all. Like I was pretty nauseated by a number of those sequences.
A lot of it is quite difficult to watch. I like this film a lot.
She goes out of her way to put you in her position.
Well, that's the
It is
thing.
harrowing.
We're getting rape scenes treated from a woman's perspective. When most of the time you see rape scenes in movies, it's there's a man behind the camera, and in this it's it feels like there's a very different perspective, and it doesn't shy away from it. It's like you're gonna sit here and you're gonna watch this.
Yeah. The film goes very far out of its way to remove like any veneer of a male gaze. I salute the hell out of that. Speaking of the literal male gaze, one of the first, I think it's the second scene in the film when she sings to the soldiers. It's immediately uncomfortable because you have this room full of soldiers who are likely far from home.
We know very far from home.
And they are
drunk.
And
bored.
And
horny.
and extremely horny.
Yeah.
And they put this poor woman like into this room with all these men sitting in chairs staring at her.
Well, they call her
while she sings.
They call her the Nightingale. Like it's like a caged bird. She's not physically in a cage, but by being owned by this man because she's a convict. So she's essentially his slave. You know, she is in a cage.
Yes.
And so that's why the film is called The Nightingale. It's about her breaking her shackles.
We get a number of shots, and at this point, like, we haven't been fully introduced to our antagonists, and we
Right.
don't know the roles of each of them. The camera cuts to a number of soldiers' reactions, and they're mostly like lecherous, like leering, and very, repulsive like expressions. And then we cut to the officer, and he has a look of like romantic love. And without the knowledge we have of him in that scene, we think like, oh, well, he's still a shitty guy, but like he's potentially less shitty. And boy, was I incorrect
Nope,
about
he
that
is-
belief?
he is
literally
the
the
worst.
worst.
Literally
I
the
didn't
worst.
quite
Like,
read it like
and
that,
he's, like, well,
just
it's like, I
because
still
we
read
get
it-
her face a lot, and
Oh.
she does not.
Well, like I say, like we see it as like a romantic love, but like still bad. And even then, like I still saw it as uncomfortable and like, but like.
Well,
I
yeah,
didn't see it
there's
as like him like lecherously leering at her. It's like almost seems to be affection. And it's a lie, and it's a very effective one.
Well,
because like, the
it's-
subversion is
Well,
immediate.
I think
It's affectionate for as long as she is being what he wants her to be.
Yeah.
But as soon as anything to the contrary is suggested, he takes it so personally that it becomes like a rage trigger for him.
Well, and I think it's partially a sleight of hand of juxtaposition.
Sure.
She doesn't seem into it from the beginning.
Well, she has a husband,
The
and
thing right
she's-
before it is we see one of the soldiers, vulgarly like flicking his tongue at her,
Yeah.
gesturing what he wanted to do. And in comparison, what he did right after doesn't seem that bad until we get to see them alone.
Right.
And we get to see
So we have to
how
see.
drastic
Well, right, like
the
that's
situation really
that's the
is.
thing is like how many times does he save is the wrong word, but like shoo off the other soldiers who are like, come here, baby, like so
Ward,
he's
yeah.
right, and he's like smacking people and being like, get out of here. And so you start to think it's like, okay, well, he's obviously kind of weird and creepy, but like maybe he's not one of the bad ones. And then, oh my God, he's the worst one.
Yeah.
It's a nice little sleight of hand thing. I had a hard time from the beginning of the film determining who the villain was going to be until they showed up to her house.
I'm going to be totally honest. Before the scene with her singing, I didn't know anything about this movie going other than it was period piece. I was half expecting them to like there to be a supernatural force or something. I didn't even know this movie didn't have that. And we picked it for a horror film. I was expecting something more akin to maybe The Witch or something, and
Right.
like there to be a ghost, because like the
Well, I
like,
mean-
I don't know, the title Nightingale to me conjures like a ghostly sort of.
And I mean, it's the second film from the director of
the
the
Babadook.
Babadook.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I was expecting.
I went in for that, and the first sequence we see with the soldiers is like a fairly standard thing where like the sergeant figure is like cussing out the other soldiers, and it's almost endearing in that like that military fashion, and like he calls them a bunch of cunts, and the officer comes in and tells him off and tells him that he looks filthy as well. It's like the soldier, hey, y'all look filthy, and he's like, yeah, but you do too, like shut the fuck
Yeah.
up, like says the officer.
It's like, go clean your boots and brush off your coat. You look like shite too.
Yeah, and it's almost a fun sequence. It's hard to see it as fun looking back at it because we know who they who they truly are is revealed to us. But I was almost expecting like them to be like protagonistic characters, like at that point.
I mean,
and
it's
that is so
nice.
immediately cut out from under itself, and it's a
I mean, they're still central characters, but yeah, I get what you're saying. It's nice to start with a little bit of levity and lightheartedness to then just rip all of that away from you. For most of the film. This is probably a thematic thing that doesn't necessarily need to be pointed out, but they keep making a big deal, the sergeant especially, calling the Aboriginal people, savages. He tells the boy,
sure.
the boy, like, they eat young boys like you, they eat kids like you. And it's like, all of the Aboriginal characters we see are by far the most civilized people in the fucking film.
They continually call the Aboriginal people boys.
Yeah.
While they call the actual boy a young man. You
Right.
know, like it's that talking down to. And,
it's the dehumanization.
And that's one of the things, you know, at the beginning, the colonialists don't seem too aggressively bad, but that's because the film isn't immediately looking at them from the indigenous perspective.
Right. Well, there is no
know?
indigenous perspective until after, you know, she's really set out on her quest. It's so
Exactly.
insulated to
And
their
Hawkins is introduced.
it's so insulated to their little colony community that there's not the outside perspective until she gets outside of that. But I just love that, like, the sergeant is threatening the little boy by saying these blacks, they eat little kids, when it's like, before this he has taken part in the murder of a child, and then that boy who he's threatening is murdered by the lieutenant later, and it's like, oh well, you don't have to worry about us, it's those others that are the danger to children. And it's like, no, it is you are the danger to the children.
Like, he's just an active hurricane. He's like everywhere he goes.
Yeah.
Like,
I couldn't help but seeing parallels to Heart of Darkness, or, you know, if we want to say, or Apocalypse Now. You know, a lot of that is because, like, most of my study of imperial colonialism is in Africa and, like, the Belgian Congo specifically. I had a whole semester in college about the shit that was done in the Belgian Congo, and so, you know, I'm naturally kind of drawn to look for that sort of thing. But I think that there's some parallels in the sense that, like, the Heart of Darkness it's not the uncivilized or the jungle. It is like the heart of these horrible, cruel people, you know, the Westerners,
well,
the so-called civilized.
We have a conversation about it in the film where Billy is talking to Claire about his own society and what they do with their own people who have those, like, bad spirits inside of them. And she asks him, what do you do? And he says, well, we speak with them, we pull them aside, we hold, like, a ceremony for them, you know, we do all these things. He says, well, what if those things do not work? And he said, what do you do with them then? He says, we don't do anything, we kill them.
We kill them.
Like, yeah. Like, those people are a threat to, like, our own society. Like, they die too. Like,
they're a threat to the peace that we have made. And then
bad spirit dies. Like, that, it's very binary, and I appreciated that.
And inversely, with the Western society, those people are allowed to
rise,
not only
and
live,
be promoted,
but to succeed. That the Western system is built for those people to
for
be
sociopaths
better off.
by sociopaths.
Right.
Exactly.
I loved that scene, especially because, like, it happens at the end after, you know, she's had her confrontation with the lieutenant, and it feels sort of like the film is wrapping up. It's like, okay, she's not gonna take the path of vengeance. She's gonna walk the high ground. She's gonna turn the other cheek. She's gonna do what would be considered, you know, the good Christian thing to do. And he's like, fuck no, we don't let those people get into higher stations. People that evil, we kill them. And so he goes and kills the dude.
I think the turning point for him was learning that his whole family,
his
was
tribe,
murdered.
His tribe has been killed.
And so his experience began reflecting Claire's, because in a lot of respects, he probably felt like he was already dead.
Yeah.
As well, you know?
Right. He had nothing.
Yeah,
anymore,
he had nothing.
Just like her.
And so he set out towards vengeance for that. And, you know, since it connected with Claire, it's good for both of them. But I think he might have done that regardless.
Oh, sure. I mean, well, he certainly does it selfishly. He doesn't like wake her up and be like, I'm going to go off and kill those two now. You know, he leaves in the night while she's asleep. She wakes up, he's not there, and knows where he's
Joke's
gone.
on him, she can't sleep.
Right, yeah.
One juxtaposition I wanted to talk about a little bit further as well is throughout the film, Claire references her connection with the Nightingale. Mm-hmm. And Billy references his connection with the Blackbird.
Thank you. I'm glad. I was going to bring that up too.
I feel like that's a good bit of foil to each character. I'm not a bird expert, so I can't really say the particular differences between nightingales and blackbirds.
Well, what he just
Is basically a parrot, is like
Yeah.
what he's talking about.
yeah, what he calls a blackbird
Is a bird that is black. It's a black parrot, basically.
Yeah.
Like, again, not a ornithologist, but it is, yeah, it's not even a
Well,
black bird in
I
that
mean,
sense.
it's-
It is just a bird that is black.
The bird that he identifies with, that he points out and says, that's me, that's what I'm named for, the blackbird, when it sort of guides her to him later, we see the bird up close and we hear its call, and he imitates its call multiple times.
They're literally birds of a feather.
Yes, but also different. They're not
Yes.
exactly the same. The blackbird that he is talking about, it has its own special song or call, that he imitates that is more connected to his culture and who he is. And a nightingale is, a very sweetly singing, pretty songbird. We hear the nightingale's call every night when she's asleep. I'm sure it's in her dreams. I don't think there are nightingales native to Tasmania, but that they find common ground despite the fact that they are still so different.
Well, I think you just touched on a really important point. You said that you don't believe nightingales are native to Tasmania.
Right, well, because she's not. Exactly. Well, that's what I'm saying. Is
Right.
She hears the call
Yeah.
of the nightingale, but that it's a dream. But right, she's out of her element. She's not from this place, but he is. And he has that special connection with this like indigenous bird.
The blackbird is his nightingale.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the bird of his land, much like the nightingale is the bird of her land.
Exactly, and they're similar but different.
yeah.
The whole,
And
the
again,
whole
like that
crux
is
of
that
it.
is the root of sympathy. I suffer with you, and so they're both given opportunities to suffer with each other. And
I think that imagery is interestingly used. I almost feel like it could have been fleshed out a little bit more.
In what way? I'm curious.
Well, not in a heavy-handed, spell it out kind of way, but I think the symbolism of it is still a bit vague.
I mean, she's called a nightingale at the beginning. She sings throughout the course of
It's
the
not
film.
that it's vague that it's connected to her. The meaning of what the nightingale and blackbird imply. It's vague.
The nightingale is a caged songbird.
I think
whereas-
those themes are
Yeah.
established.
They maybe could have done more with it, but I felt satisfied with it. I thought it was just enough. I almost thought the parrot appearing to her and guiding her back to him, I almost felt like it was heavy-handed, but I didn't.
No, because it could also just be circumstantial. Like she saw a bird that has been already established to be native of that area.
Sure.
You're going to see those types of birds, and that she just happened to wander across the path.
Right. Well, she clearly recognized that bird as a sign.
Of course.
Yeah, she
because
followed,
and
right.
in nature those events occur.
Sure.
Like it's pareidolia, like whether they actually have any context or not is really up to you. But
Right, she sees it as a
it's
sign.
believable.
Was it a sign? Maybe not. It
But whether
gets
that
her-
thing could have happened in this world or not is
Oh, sure,
plenty
sure.
fine. Yeah.
Sure. No,
Well,
I thought
and
that was
realism,
fine.
the symbolism of
But it
birds
is almost too
in
much.
general.
I agree. It feels
is the hope of flying free.
Right.
And that's something both of them dream of in a lot of respects, without the oppressive nature of their situation. That definitely is implied in the movie. I just think birds are pretty common symbols. I don't know. I just think at times it can be construed as a little vague. That's just my opinion, though.
I think it's pretty specific to nightingales, for her character. I think like all the thematic points hit.
I think it's enough that I get what the film is trying to say by the end. I think it says it. I think it says it, and it's subtle. I don't think it's too vague. I don't think I would really say.
Yeah, I wouldn't
vague
see
at
how
all.
like what would you have wanted like it to do or it to add in to better establish that theme.
I feel like I would have loved to see a bit more of it reflecting their hopes of flying free in some respects.
I mean, I don't think she starts to really relate herself so much to a bird until she is traveling with Billy, because he's named for that bird. His real name is the Aboriginal name for that bird, so he is very deeply connected to it and is explaining that to her and pointing out, that's me, I'm the blackbird, and I think that as she starts to see that she has more in common with him than she thought, she finds that same parallel. You're the blackbird, I'm the nightingale. She finds that point of relation with him because of his attachment to that symbol of the bird.
Yeah.
I mean, the film is called The Nightingale, so when we see her called a nightingale at the very beginning, it's like, oh, that's why.
Yeah, she's a slave and she sings like she's a caged bird. It's very
There's gonna be some significance, but I don't think that she
Nightingales are caged
I don't
birds,
think
so.
that she finds that significance for herself until she meets
well, she
Bill.
learns to be comfortable with being a nightingale.
I feel like the blackbird is much more emphasized throughout the movie until the very end, where she even brings up the nightingale.
Right, in her confrontation.
The only time the nightingale aspect of it is brought up is very beginning and her confrontation.
I mean, you hear there's an audio cue.
Yeah, the part with her dreams as well.
Yeah, because she's lived
happens,
as a nightingale all up until the circumstances of the film, of a nightingale.
And we hear the nightingale. We hear the nightingale sing. We hear its song every night when they settle down to camp when she's sleeping. So I think that there's
in
enough,
every dream sequence it's reinforced, and
I think that there's enough of that auditory cue to remind us of it enough that it feels.
I mean, she's certainly not going to sing like when she's in the woods
thematically
and dealing with all of those circumstances. It would be out of character. But I mean,
she does that one night.
She does at the very end.
She does one of the nights when she's camping with Billy. He starts singing and she says, shut up that racket, it's ugly, or whatever. Then they have their conversation and he tells her what the white man has taken from him. Yeah. And
they even do establish it there.
Right.
Yeah.
And that scene ends with her singing a song in Gaelic. There is that thematic through line.
Right.
I guess to capstone the bird stuff is this movie is quite literal in, the events it portrays to a harrowing degree. The symbolism and imagery that were there and the more interpretive aspects of it were so rich to me that I almost wanted more. I think that's what I mostly meant by that.
Sure. Okay. It was enough for me, but I don't think that's wrong. I think they could have done more and it wouldn't have been heavy-handed. Mm-hmm. Do you guys want to go ahead and rate this?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'll start and we can go around. I thought this was great. I had, there's a couple little minor gripes, but ultimately very small things. I don't know if I want to necessarily watch this movie again anytime soon because it's such an emotional journey or event. I don't know what exactly how to address that. But man, it's damn good storytelling and the acting is phenomenal. I loved it up and down. 4.5 out of 5 for me.
Yeah, well, I'm going to mirror a lot of that. I had a few minor critiques, but overall, I thought it was a pretty incredible movie. I'm going to give it a 4.5 out as well.
Bring us home, Cleveman.
I saw it as a masterclass film. I'd give it a 5 personally.
All right. Well, that's a strong 4.7 out of 5 for The Nightingale. Very, very, very good movie. It's on Hulu right now. Go check it out if you've sat through all of this and don't care about spoilers, obviously. Next week is to be decided. There are some circumstances that we don't quite know how they're going to shake out yet. We will have an episode next week.
It's a surprise.
But it'll be a surprise episode. And next week is Thanksgiving as well. So we'll be bringing you a nice big old fat stuffing filled episode next week. And you'll just have to stay tuned and see what it is. why don't we get a word from our sponsor?
This episode was brought to you by colonialism and how much it sucks. Fuck colonialism, and there you go. That's our sponsor. Our sponsor is fuck colonialism.
Now, I think that that's a product that we can all get behind.
And if you can't, fuck you.
Fuck colonialism, and if you don't acknowledge that Western culture is built upon the bones of millions, then you're a piece of shit, and I don't want to talk to you. If you're not one of those people and you like the show, then please feel free to leave us a 5-star rating and a nice review on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get your podcasts. Help us grow in the numbers. Share an episode that you like with your friends. Maybe this episode, maybe a different episode. We got a nice long back catalog to check out if you haven't heard those. You can also follow us on Twitter at PodPeoplePod and at letterboxd.com/PodPeoplePod for a list of all the films we've talked about on our show, along with our average ratings and links to the corresponding episodes. You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. Van Awesome.
I'm on Twitter at Mr. Sheets.
I'm occasionally tweeting for Light Arc Studio. We're giving you all some information on It Stares Back. Please check it out. It's on Steam. It's our horror indie game that we've been working on for a couple years now. Join us on our Discord as well as we continue to update our process.
That's right. You can find the link to our Discord at that Twitter handle or at lightarcstudio.com and scoop up It Stares Back from Steam while it's hot, while we're in early access. It's only $6 at the time of recording, but it won't be that way forever. So scoop it up while you have a chance and let us know what you think. We really appreciate it. Hope you're having a good November, staying warm, gearing up for the Turkey Day, and yeah, we'll see you then. Gobble, gobble.